Right, grade 12. The next lesson that we are going to look at is the appropriateness of South Africa's industrial policies. All right, now on the exam guideline, you will see it says broadly outline the appropriateness of South Africa's industrial policies. So this is by no means like a long question at all. At most, I think, maybe incorporated in a dot response question, maybe short questions, maybe. Okay, this is not something that they ask very often. All right. Obviously, they can ask you to evaluate the appropriateness of South Africa's industrial policies for 8 marks as well. All right, but if you look at the old exam papers, they've never asked this before, really, never concentrated on this before, but obviously never say never, ne? We don't know. All right. So make sure that you go over this at least, but I wouldn't waste a lot of time on studying this section. All right, now obviously we've looked now at our different industrial policies. We looked at the different industrial strategies that we have used. And we did mention that we always look at international best practice. We always look at challenges that other countries have faced, solutions that they came up with, what strategies are they using, what are they doing to overcome their challenges. And then obviously we see if we can use their strategies and just adapt for our situation. And when we look at our policies and our strategies that we incorporate for industrial development, our policies compare well with international best practice for regional development, but there are certain shortcomings in our regional policies. So what we are saying is obviously it compares favorably in terms of international best practice. What international best practice is, we're going to do in a next lesson. Okay, you'll see that is an essay question again. All right, so what is international best practice? We'll focus on that later. Okay, but there are certain shortcomings, there are certain things, shortcomings in our policies where it doesn't comply really with international best practice. But if we firstly look at our success factors, where have our policies been successful? All right, now the first thing there, any interventions that we've used through the IPAP, through the NIPF, the interventions that we have used for the focused industries that we've chosen were based on sound economic research and analysis. In other words, we didn't just pick out of air or like guessed what we are going to do. The targeted industries was chosen after thorough research and analysis to identify which ones are the sectors with potential and which interventions would give us the best results. So we didn't just pluck it out of the air. There was research and analysis involved, meaning that we chose possibly the best possible strategy, the best possible intervention. Okay. Then there was substantial progress and growth in the upgrading of our value-added services. Okay, so obviously remember, as focus areas, we have value-added minerals, right? So we're in the mining industry, we do not export commodities. We want to add value to our minerals before we export. Same thing in agriculture. We don't export raw materials. We add value before we export a finished product, a processed product, a manufacturing product. And there was substantial progress in that regard. All right, so our value-added services, there was improvement as a result of the interventions, as well as with labor-intensive manufacturing. Okay, remember we said we need to focus on labor-absorbing activities because we have such a high unemployment rate and a high level of unskilled workforce. Obviously, we need to create, when we do industrial development, it has to be done in such a way that unskilled labor is absorbed into the labor market, and there was success in that regard. All right. Great success was also achieved in combating customs fraud and illegal imports and products of inferior quality. Okay, so obviously in terms of the customs services, the inspections, when goods comes into our country, when we are importing things, there's less fraud in terms of the customs services, the customs officials, and we clamp down on illegal imports. They find the illegal imports, they find the things that we don't want to allow into the country, and they send them back. And then obviously the products that we are importing now, we are not finding so much inferior quality product. The products that we are bringing in actually has a high quality. There was also an alignment between our trade policy, our international trade policy, and the industrial policy. Okay, and this has resulted in our industries becoming a little bit more competitive in the global markets. Just remember, our trade policy refers to our export promotion and import substitution policies. All right. So obviously, because of maybe export subsidies that we are paying, it decreases the production costs. So our exports are more competitive in terms of lower prices, which obviously will increase the demand for our exports internationally. Then the Motor Industrial Development Program. This is a program that contains a requirement that locally assembled vehicles, so any locally manufactured vehicles, must contain a minimum quantity of locally manufactured content. So for example, where we assemble the vehicles in South Africa, we might import the engine from Germany, but the steel that the body is made of is sourced from local sources. Obviously, we have Iscor, we have the iron ore, we manufacture our own steel products. So it's basically a question of local content first. Okay, the program is called Local Content First, whereby anything like in the motor vehicle industry, obviously this is a targeted industry in terms of our industrial development targets. And it's one of the industries that was targeted throughout every single IPAP as an industry with potential. But very important there that program contains a requirement that when that they have to use local content, right? They have to use local steel, as much local content as possible. When the car is assembled, parts of it has to be sourced locally. It can't all be imported and then just put together in this country. All right, and obviously that leads to the growth in the other industries. If we start using local steel, obviously, if the car manufacturing industry is growing, they're going to need more steel to assemble more cars. That means that the steel industry has the potential to grow as well. So it spills over into other industries. Then the IDC investments in BE expansion has created a fair amount of jobs. Okay, remember IDC, the Industrial Development Corporation, they make financing available for larger projects. Obviously, investing a lot of money or providing financing to a lot of BEE projects, so BEE compliant businesses, whereas also that creates a lot of employment. Now, every business that is created obviously creates jobs for a certain amount of people. And then lastly, technology programs have been successful in facilitating industrial development. All right, so our investment in technology, remember that was also a shortcoming that we have identified, is that we have to pay attention to technology and science, and those programs have been successful in terms of stimulating industrial development. Okay, that's the success factors. But now if we look at the constraints, right? External and internal constraints. External constraints are factors that are out there, outside of our country, that we obviously have no control over, that makes our industrial development policies less successful because of impacts from outside the country. All right. So the first external constraint was that the time period when we implemented the NIPF and IPAP 1 and 2, that was during the time when the world was experiencing the biggest global recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. All right. So the implementation of the NIPF and the IPAP, 1 and 2, obviously it wasn't very extremely successful because industrial development didn't take place, not because our policies wasn't great, but because internationally the world was in recession. So obviously, there was no growth. There was no growth in our country. There was no growth in other countries either. So obviously this had a big impact on us. As a developing country specifically, we depend on a lot of income received from developed countries. And when developed countries are experiencing recessionary conditions, people in those countries don't have money. They don't buy from us. So our exports will decrease, our injections will decrease. It just means that less money is available in South Africa for development. All right. And the manufacturing sector was one of the industries that was hit the hardest. All right. Because people would cut down on their spending. If they're not buying, why should we produce? All right. So it was just an external factor. It wasn't something that we had any control over. It wasn't that we did something wrong. But obviously this had a big negative impact and it made the implementation, the NIPF and the IPAP, less successful. All right. Second problem, the exchange rate could not always stabilize the production sectors of the economy. So obviously there was fluctuations in the exchange rates, which creates a huge amount of uncertainty. All right. obviously in terms of exports and imports, whether the rand is appreciating, whether it's depreciating, it will have advantages for exporters, disadvantages for exporters, advantages, disadvantages for importers, depending on whether you are an importer or an exporter. All right, so obviously any time that the exchange rate will appreciate or depreciate, it creates uncertainty. Okay, when the rand depreciates, for example, it means that anything that we import is becoming more expensive. So anybody that imports raw materials is going to pay more for those raw materials, or importing machines, it's going to pay them more. It increases their production cost. It makes them less competitive because their production costs are higher, not because of any mistake on their side, purely because the rand depreciated, for example. All right. So as I mentioned, the global recession obviously results in a decreased demand. I did mention that. If in our trading partners like America, like the European Union, like China, if those countries have a recession, it means that their economies are not growing, their people are losing their jobs, their income levels are decreasing. And if they don't have money, they don't buy American goods, they don't buy South African goods, they don't buy any goods. And when the demand decreases, obviously our exports decrease, as I said, and then there's less money in our country available for industrial development because the demand has dropped. Right, in terms of internal constraints, okay, so things that we have more control over, things that limited the success of industrial development because of factors in our own country. Okay, the first thing there is the increases in electricity and logistics costs. Logistics is transport, all right? So the increase in the cost of electricity and the increase in the cost of transport. Obviously, that is a big negative for the industrial sector because it means that your factories, which uses a lot of electricity, is paying more for electricity, they're paying more for transport, and that increases their production cost, which increases their selling prices, which means that they are less competitive. And a lot of smaller businesses actually was forced to close down. They simply could not maintain profitability. All right, their costs just exceeded their revenue when electricity and transport increases that much. And remember, we discussed this in supply side factors as well. These infrastructural components, the price of electricity is determined. ESCOM obviously is government, right? Transport cost is usually determined by the price of petrol, and the price of petrol is determined by the government. Okay, so it's totally under our government's control. But when there's increases in the cost of infrastructure, obviously that has a huge impact on businesses. All right, then the progress with regarding skills shortages, that's very slow. Obviously, we have CETAs, we want to encourage education and training, but we still find that the majority of our labor force is still unskilled. So the CETAs did not really achieve their aims. So lots and lots and lots of money, billions of rand is paid towards the CETAs to make sure that training does happen. But sometimes they did not reach their targets. Okay, the training wasn't as successful as what we would have wanted. Initially, the CETAs was under the supervision of the Department of Labor, all right, because it is a labor issue. They have moved it now to under the Department of Education, okay, higher education, hoping that when the focus is more on education and less on labor, that it might be more successful. But obviously, we have to see about that in the future. All right. So all the money that was basically spent on the CETAs, they did not always spend all the money that they were allocated, or it was used inefficiently, all right, to pay for training that wasn't relevant, for example. Okay, remember, it is the CETA's role to also make sure that any training is relevant to that industry, and it isn't always. All right, so money is wasted on training people, and the skills that they gain is actually useless. It means nothing. Right. Then there's also backlogs in infrastructure expenditure on all levels of government. So the upgrading and the expansion of infrastructure is just not happening as it should. Sometimes money is allocated and that money is not spent, or the money is spent elsewhere, but the upgrading of the infrastructure is not happening even though it is budgeted for. Okay. Then domestic demand was also weaker. All right. As much as what the world had a recession, South Africa also had a recession. Okay, so obviously people in South Africa also was losing their jobs and they could not buy as much as before, which means that our domestic demand decreased as well. Added to that, the implementation of the National Credit Act, which made it a lot more difficult for people to qualify for credit. And there's a large amount of people in our country, a large amount of the spending in our country is actually spending on credit. So when people don't have access to credit, obviously their demand is also lower. And if the demand drops, obviously production is going to drop in response to that. Another problem is administered price inflation. Okay, remember we have an inflation target. We want our inflation rate to be between 3 and 6%. But administered prices, okay, think a little bit. We did discuss about administered prices when we did inflation. Administered prices are any prices that are under the control of the government or prices that are influenced by the government. All right, things like the petrol price. Petrol price is an administered price. The interest rate is an administered price. The cost of electricity is an administered price. What we pay for sanitation and garbage removal, all of those are administered prices because it is decided on by the government. All right. Now, we want our inflation rate to be kept between 3 and 6%. That is our target. But when the government increases their prices, these administered prices, when the electricity is pushed up, when the petrol price is adjusted, when interest rates change, those changes, those increases are sometimes higher than the inflation target. So where the inflation target is between 3 to 6%, for example, and Eskom is granted an increase of 12.5%, that means that it's going to fuel inflation. Okay, people are going to pay more for electricity, which means they're going to have less money to spend on other things to stimulate production and industrial development. All right, and obviously these administered prices are totally under the control of the government. All right, so it's something that they can do something about, but they consistently, administered prices have been increasing much higher than what the inflation rate actually is. Okay, the next problem is the relatively high labor costs coupled with low productivity. Remember, we said that when wage increases happen, okay, together with a wage increase, it is supposed to go hand in hand with an increase in productivity. Otherwise, it creates inflation. All right, and what we find in our country is that wages are going up, but people's productivity is not really increasing. All right, and that is creating an inflation problem. And with inflation, obviously, things are becoming more expensive. People can't afford to buy as much as before. All right. Third last problem is inefficiencies in the rail and port freight and logistics system. So basically, again, the transport system, the railways, the harbors, the transport system in general is inefficient. In other words, it takes longer than what it is supposed to. All right, so the railways, they don't always deliver on time, or it is expensive. We've spoken about the cost of infrastructure. Harbors, there's huge backlogs to clear. Remember, I said when those containers arrive, the customs officials have to go through those containers, count the stuff in there, check for illegal things, and that takes time. And that means at any given point in time, if your container arrives at the harbor, sometimes you wait for 6 months. That is a backlog. Okay, that shouldn't happen. It's inefficient. Efficiency would be if that container arrives, it gets checked immediately and the stuff gets cleared. But it unfortunately doesn't happen like that. All right, and then the second last problem is that both public and private investment has been very slow. So the whole thing with industrial development, it was to encourage, remember, PPPs. The government would spend some money, they would invest money in improving the infrastructure in the underdeveloped areas, but private investment must start businesses. It just wasn't as successful as what they thought it was going to be. Okay, people were not as willing to invest their money, and the economic, it didn't stimulate a lot of economic growth. Okay, it didn't happen as much as what they wanted it to happen. And then lastly, our competition policy must be reviewed and strengthened so that it can deal with unintended market behaviors. We know we have competition policy. Price fixing is not supposed to happen. Price wars are not supposed to happen. Anti-competitive behavior is not supposed to happen, but it does. All right, so we need to strengthen the working of the competition policy. There needs to be stricter supervision to make sure that competition is actually functioning in the markets, because competition is what makes the markets more efficient and then competitive in the end. All right.